Thanks everyone for joining us. I'm Jordan Rutter, Director of Communications for American Bird Conservancy and your host today. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared with you afterward. We'll be putting links in the chat, but in case you missed them, please know that everything can be found in a follow-up email we'll send to everyone who registered. Automated captions are available for this webinar, and you can turn them on by clicking on the CC icon. Please submit any questions you have during the presentations using the Q&A box. This is a really special webinar, and not just because I'm so excited to soar into the fascinating world of nightjars with all of you, but because this Friday, November 1st, officially marks American Bird Conservancy's 30th anniversary. And as part of that celebration, we'll be unveiling a fresh new look over the coming months, including a new logo that you can see on the screen and over my shoulder and across our digital platforms that represent the birds we work to conserve and the habitat they need to make their conservation possible. Birds inspire and delight us. They fill us with wonder. They do so much from pollination to pest control, but birds are also disappearing fast. And thanks to support from people like you, ABC is taking bold action for birds across the Americas. And we're getting results. With diverse partners, we're preventing imminent bird extinctions, improving millions of acres of habitat with bird-friendly management practices, and advocating for and creating solutions to urgent threats that put all birds at risk. There's so many more exciting things to come, and I'm so glad you're here with us today as we embark on the next 30 years of bird conservation. And as you'll learn about today with Nightjars, when it comes to conserving birds across the Americas, every acre counts. With our partners and thanks to generous support from people like you, American Bird Conservancy has conserved millions of acres of habitat for birds across the Americas in the last 30 years. But as habitat loss is the most urgent threat facing wild birds today, we need your help to continue this critical work. Birds need every bit of habitat we can give them. So will you make every acre count for birds with a tax-deductible gift today? You can make a gift right now by visiting abcbirds.org/EAC or by scanning the code on your screen with your phone. Thank you so much for caring about birds, and a special thank you to all of our members and supporters in the audience right now. You're making a difference for wild birds and their habitats every day. People often share their thoughts with us when they sign up for our webinars about the birds we're featuring or the topics we're discussing, but I don't think we've quite ever had a response to a webinar topic like this one. My Nana loved to listen to the whippoorwill, someone shared. We would drive to a country location and hope to hear them, and that was back in the 60s and 70s. Have not heard one since. Missed their song so much. Someone else shared, I remember them as a child in the Adirondacks, longed to hear their evening song again. Another person summed up what so many of you shared with us by saying simply, I miss the night music of my youth. And it's no surprise that a bird family with species named for their evocative calls would stir up so many powerful emotions inside people, and I'm one of them. Nightjars definitely hold a special place in my heart too, and they make me think of summer skies at night, spotting that boomerang shape soaring and swooping through the air in pursuit of insects. They're unique, mysterious, and I'd even say a little punk rock, because you don't get labeled as goat suckers in myth and folklore without striking a chord in the human imagination. And as a bird professional, I can tell you that nightjars are generally under-researched, which means there's still so much to learn and wonder about them. They are regularly overshadowed by birds like owls. In fact, there might be some of you today who signed up for this webinar because you saw a picture of a bird you didn't even know existed before. But that's about to change, and I'm so excited about it because nightjars are simply amazing, and they need our help to ensure that more people can fall in love with their night music. I can't wait for you to learn more about them and how ABC is working to conserve them. So let's meet today's speakers and the birds. First up, we have Gretchen Newberry, who is the author of The Nighthawk's Evening, a book that describes her research and travels to find nighthawks in the American West and offers hope for a declining species. Her work focuses on common nighthawks in South Dakota's urban and rural areas focused on habitat loss, heat stress, and nest success. And Gretchen's blog, A Feathered Reptile, is a collection of her art and writing on conservation issues. Jeffrey Larkin is a habitat biologist at Massachusetts Division of Fisheries and Wildlife. He earned his Bachelor's of Science from Indiana University of Pennsylvania in Environmental Conservation and Evolutionary Biology, and his Master's of Science in Forest Resources from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Jeffrey's area of interest is in applied conservation science, where he works to inform habitat management for many eastern forest wildlife species. Ann Minnie is the Senior Science Coordinator for the Lower Mississippi Valley Joint Venture, and her main role is to coordinate strategic planning and research, developing a shared vision of bird conservation in an 8-state region. Ann helps ensure that the goals and objectives of international and national bird plans are being met through partnership and that we are being innovative in our solutions for bird conservation. And with that, I'll turn it over to Gretchen to kick things off.
All right, can everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. And turn over to my presentation, which, there we go. All right. Well, thank you. Go ahead.
I just said, take it away.
Okay, great. So thank you to the American Bird Conservancy for hosting this webinar. And welcome. I'm Gretchen Newberry. I'll be introducing the Nightjars today and then talking about my Nighthawk study. So this is me and a chick on a rooftop right next to their nest at the University of South Dakota, where I worked on my PhD. And so let's start with nightjars. So what is a nightjar? So they are members of the bird order the Capromulgiformes, and that's Latin for goat sucker. And they were named for the legend that they would suck the milk from livestock. And I think people just didn't understand what this mysterious animal was doing, flying around their livestock at night. So they figured they were drinking their animal's milk. Excuse me. But they weren't. They were eating the insects that fly around their goats. They most likely had a beneficial effect on livestock by managing these bothersome and potentially disease-carrying insects. And it's not the first time that nightjars would be misunderstood. There are 96 species of nightjars in the family, most of which live in the southern hemisphere. You can see in purple. The largest is the great-eared nightjar of India and Indonesia, and it is 16 inches long and gets featured widely on social media because it looks like a dragon. All right, so what are the nightjars in North America? We have whippoorwills. I believe we've dropped the eastern off that. Chuckwill's widow, common poorwill, Antillean nighthawk, the common nighthawk, which I'll talk about, and the lesser nighthawk. So the lesser nighthawks are desert specialists. They live in the Southwest. Antillean nighthawks, they visit Florida. Common poorwills are the only bird known to hibernate. They were first described in writing by Lewis and Clark when the Lakota pointed them out. Of course, Native Americans know all about these birds. Whippoorwills and chuckwill widows will be introduced today by Jeffrey Larkin and Ann Minnie. Less common in North America are the common paraque and the Mexican whippoorwill that you can see in southern Texas and New Mexico. And all of these birds eat insects and none of them drink the milk of goats. This is the common nighthawk. So maybe you've heard this call around sunset, keeps you up at night. You might see this bird with its acrobatic flight around urban areas. Beaches, open forests like the pine barrens in the east or in the sagebrush out west. In urban areas, it nests on large flat gravel rooftops like hospitals and schools. I studied them on rooftops because I couldn't find them in the area where I was studying them in eastern South Dakota. It's very rich in row crops. And that's because in the last 20 years in North America, we have lost enough grassland to fill the state of Kansas. And we lost that due to the push for ethanol production and the conversion of prairies to cornfields. These are migrating nighthawks along the Mississippi River outside of La Crosse, Wisconsin. And, you know, every year enormous flocks migrate together in the fall. And if you go to Hawk Ridge Mountain and Duluth, Minnesota. And I use the word mountain really loosely there. This is Minnesota. You can see thousands in a day. So why are they called nighthawks if they are flying around like this during the day? Well, they're mostly active around sunset, but they're neither nocturnal nor a hawk, and they're becoming less common. So they are the worst name ever. I should mention these photos and videos from my study are done for scientific purposes with all the required permits. So any pictures you see like this at night were taken with my headlamp, and I don't recommend getting this close to the birds or using flash photography on wildlife at night. They are found coast to coast in various degrees of success. Red is where they are declining, blue is where they are increasing, white is where they are mostly, if not entirely, gone. Nighthawks live from Alaska to Argentina. Some migrate, while some stay in the southern hemisphere year-round. This is a map from a study led by Ellie Knight out of the University of Alberta. And I and other Nighthawk researchers worked together from across Canada and the US to put satellite transmitters on Nighthawks. And it's fascinating to see that most join up along the Mississippi Flyway to migrate south, even the West Coast birds. They can live in prairies, open forests, on beaches even. They are ground nesters. They like sagebrush. They like a lot of different habitats, but what they all have in common is an open area. So even if they're in forest, they have to be an open forest. These lower right ones, those are the nighthawks that I found on rooftops. This is a pair I studied on a hospital rooftop in a small town in South Dakota called Vermilion, where I went to school at the University of South Dakota. They can use rooftops anywhere as long as they are flat and have gravel, and they need that to disguise the eggs. And in case you missed it, that is the female. Her white throat patch is smaller, and the male that's flying above her has outer white tail feather patches, and that's how you really can identify them. Sometimes females have a beige patch, but mostly it's those tail feathers and the size of the throat patch. And these two birds nested a few feet away from a helicopter pad, and then the final year there was a construction site. So they're pretty resilient birds. This is me on a South Dakota rooftop. And a lot of times, oops, come back. There we go. This is me video what it's like to search for a nighthawk nest. You can see they just blend right in, and all of a sudden, boom, there it goes. A lot of time people didn't know they had nighthawks on a roof. You have to get real close for them to flush. They are so great at camouflage, and they tend only to come out at sunset. So part of my work was explaining what a nighthawk was and why it was important to study. Everybody likes animals that eat bugs. So this video is what it's like to search for a nest, and then suddenly they'll skitter away. Okay, why do they like gravel? They need camouflage for their eggs and chicks. They don't make a nest, so they need to stay with their young to thermoregulate them. And staying camouflaged keeps the adults, eggs, and chicks hidden during the day. So if you can see on the right, those are the chicks, little bits of fluff, and then the two ovals on the left are the eggs. Um, they are a generalist in theory. They can live in a lot of habitats, but they're becoming more and more of a specialist in their habitat. They like forests, but those are disappearing. They like beaches, but they are getting crowded with tourism. They like grassland, but we plow them over for road crop. And they like gravel rooftops, but we are removing the gravel these days and replacing it with different roofing materials. If you are a birder and you're looking for a nighthawk, you can explore eBird and see other people's observations. Those little blue teardrops are the observations. And then if you want to zoom in and try to find a flat gravel rooftop, chances are you will see them come back to that spot over and over because they're hanging around their nest site. So flat gravel rooftop, it's going to be gray. It's going to be kind of pebbly colored. That's where you can find them. So hospitals, schools, strip malls, box stores. Um, and they nest in June and July when they're breeding. They like it hot when the insects are flying. And they have one of the shortest breeding seasons of any bird. They are the last to arrive and the first to leave in almost any situation. That was a boom call. They have a number of defenses. They use the sound. Let me go back to that. They use the sound between their feathers to dive to ward off intruders, and that's how they survive. They do put on a big show. But too much disturbance means they have to lure the potential predator away, and that's time they lose helping their chicks stay cool. Their chicks are more exposed to the weather than cavity or tree nesters. They're especially vulnerable the first couple of days of their life when they're entirely rely on their parents for thermoregulation because they are not yet mobile enough to find sun or shade to counteract the sun, wind, or rain, as the case may be. In addition, every instance of stress due to interaction with predators like people or dogs or grad students like me activates the hippocampus, a pituitary adrenal stress hormone pathway that diverts resources from building fat and tissues to grow strong enough to fly away. And they have to do that within 3 weeks and migrate to South America a month or so later. So they have a lot of work to do as chicks. They have a lot of attitude and not much else. They have tiny bills and not much for claws. So even their chicks have to have attitude. Camouflage is great defense for predators that rely on sight like other birds, but for ground nesting birds, they have to deal with predators that rely on scent like dogs and cats, and camouflage isn't much of a defense against that. They also put on quite a display when you're at their nest. Sometimes they use this broken wing routine like the killdeer do, or they might lure you away like this bird. Nightjars have a superpower, though they can withstand a lot of heat. They do this by panting or entering torpor, which is a short form of hibernation that lasts less than a day. They lower their metabolism and hunker down until it's time to eat. This is a chick that's only a few days old. Let's see if I can get it started there. Okay, unlike songbirds, it's fully feathered and able to walk to shade after a few days after hatching. But watch what it does when it gets to shade. It's vibrating its bill and gular region of its throat to dissipate heat. They are they're only second to doves and pigeons in their ability to withstand heat. But unfortunately, their eggs don't have that ability. Of all my nests on these rooftops, only 10% successfully hatched an egg and got it to the second week of life. Um, Anytime a nighthawk had to leave a nest to lure away a predator, anytime a parent was disturbed by fireworks, I had one site that never successfully hatched an egg around July 4th. That's time away from eggs at a very hot site. So what can we do? We can keep our pets from roaming freely. These are my two cats. I put them on a leash. They're tied together. They don't do much damage because they don't ever agree on where they're going to go. Lots of critters live on the ground, including nighthawk chicks that recently fledge. We can protect our ground nesters. This is a campaign by the Audubon at the National Wildlife Refuges on the East Coast on behalf of shorebirds. Nighthawks also nest on beaches, and there have been studies about nighthawks on Louisiana beaches and the effects of predators. On the sign is a QR code that tells folks where there are nearby off-leash areas, which I find genius. Communication is key when we want to conserve nightjars because people just don't know they're there. Across the pond in the UK, they're doing stuff for the European nightjar. In the US, we're not super aware about ground nesting nightjars. In my book, I talk about the efforts to protect nighthawks on British Columbia beaches, but this is pretty cool too. This is the Thames Basin Heath Partnership that has signs asking folks to keep their dogs leashed on behalf of nightjars. They also lead nightjar walks at night so people can see them in action. This is a great example of stuff we could do in this country. And in fact, if you're interested in, this is right outside of London. We can create green roofs to keep them cool with gravel patches for animals that use rooftops for nesting. The effort to change out the flat gravel rooftops is because people want to find more environmentally conscious ways of keeping the roof cool. This is one option, and then there are other birds that will benefit, like killdeer that also nest on rooftops. We can conserve habitat. This is a map of the Missouri River where I studied nighthawks. 1890s, that's the top one. Had lots of sandbar, grassland, and forest. This landscape was rich in whippoorwills and nighthawks. On the bottom one is now. So brown is row crop agriculture. There are still whippoorwills in those small forest patches, but nighthawks don't nest there anymore. They moved into town where their rooftops are being converted to other roofing types. We can conserve insects, so I can't go by without mentioning the theme for this year's World Migratory Bird Day. It was protect insects, protect birds. Nighthawks are a member of a guild called the Aerial Insectivores, which includes nighthawks, swallows, swifts, and bats. They are the fastest dwindling guild of birds in the world. Here they are in lavender. Coincidentally, the next most imperiled birds are grassland birds in yellow, and nighthawks are members of both those guilds. To aerial insectivores, to protect them, we should keep an eye on pesticide use. Lots of it ends up in wetlands, the nurseries for insects that nighthawks eat. Insects serve as an important base for an ecosystem, and pesticides just don't differentiate between insects, whether they're beneficial or pest species. So with that, I want to say thank you for your interest in nightjars. If you follow the hashtag nightjar on social media, you'll see lots of images and art around nighthawks and other nightjars throughout the world. Nature photographers and artists have done a great job of raising awareness of these amazing birds. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jeffrey as soon as I can stop sharing.
Thanks so much, Gretchen. That was such a great overview, and we'll talk more to you during the Q&A portion at the end of the presentations. But Jeffrey, if you want to get all set up, we'll be excited to hear about what you have to share about Eastern whippoorwill.
Sounds good. Let's see. So can you see that there?
Yep, you're all set.
Awesome, thank you. And hello, everybody. Thanks for being here today. I'm excited to share with you all my master's thesis research, which was focused on Eastern whippoorwill response to forest management in the Eastern United States. So the Eastern whippoorwill is a nocturnal aerial insectivore, meaning that it's active at night and it captures its insect prey, which is primarily beetles and moths, while flying through the air. And this species really requires, it inhabits the forests of Eastern North America, as we can see in this range map here. The blue is its wintering grounds, and the orange area is the breeding grounds. And during its time on the breeding grounds, it really requires diverse forest conditions, ranging from early successional to mature closed canopy forests. Before I get too in-depth on the species background, I want to talk a little bit about how cool and unique this species is. So those who are unfamiliar with the whippoorwill song, it is a three-part song, and the mnemonic for the species is just its name, whippoorwill. And if we take a look at this individual here, we can see that it has this really cool mottled black and brown pattern that allows it to blend in with its surroundings really well. And if we take a close look at some of the features, it has this large beady eye, deceivingly large mouth, and whiskers that help it effectively capture its prey at night. And if we take a look at this image down here where that red arrow is, you can see how efficient this species is at capturing its prey there. That is a mouthful of moths. Eastern whippoorwill are a ground nesting species, dare you call it a nest, that is more of a depression in the leaf litter. Typically has a clutch size of 2 eggs, and what emerges from those 2 eggs after incubation is this alien-like chick. And something that's really cool about this species is that its ecology is really closely tied to the moon. Its nesting is closely tied to the lunar cycle, and it forages using lunar illumination. And what I mean by this is that the species requires young forests for foraging. It sits on the forest floor of this young forest and where it can see the moon, and it waits for its prey to get backlit by the moon. And whenever it sees its prey in the night sky, it'll sally upwards and capture it. And this is just a quick visualization of a whippoorwill foraging. So you can see how that individual would wait for that insect to fly in front of the moon and sally upwards. Now, although the whippoorwill is a very cool and unique species to study, it's also a really important species to study. It's been experiencing significant population declines over the past half century, which have primarily been attributed to two main factors. First is reduced food availability. So we've all seen the articles that chronicle the decline of insects globally. But what's the primary driver of the species decline is thought to be habitat loss and degradation. So we can think of this in terms of forest succession, young forests reverting to mature closed canopy forests, and no new young forests being created on the landscape. Now, when it comes to monitoring eastern whippoorwill, it's very logistically difficult species to study. They're active at night and they're singing in these young forests, which are very difficult to navigate at night. But luckily, there's technology that can help facilitate monitoring this species, such as the Autonomous Recording Unit, otherwise known as an ARU. And ARUs are used to monitor species via auditory cues. And you can think of vocalizations such as what we hear in this clip of the prairie warbler singing. Now, this technology is growing in popularity as the technology itself, the analysis of its data, and the cost of these units are becoming more user-friendly. And just to give you an idea of what it takes to monitor a single site with an ARU, these are all the supplies that are needed. That unit's about the size of a credit or debit card. And whenever all these supplies are assembled and it's put in that bag and zip tied to a tree, it lasts for about 180 hours worth of recording. So now I'm going to start moving into my research on the eastern whippoorwill and how I use ARUs to monitor species at a large spatial extent. So in 2020 and 2021, we deployed 1,265 autonomous recording units ranging from Western North Carolina to Southern Maine. These were deployed across both public and private lands and deployed across a variety of management practices that represented a gradient of forest management intensity. So we can think of mature unmanaged forest as a low management intensity, and clear cut in that lower right-hand corner as high management intensity. And we surveyed sites, everything in between those two as well. Moving into some of our ARU methodology, whippoorwills have two-week survey windows annually that are centered around the lunar cycle. So we programmed our units to record for 2 hours a day from 9 to 11 o'clock at night and deployed them to capture at least one of the two whippoorwill survey windows. After these units had been out there recording, we returned back to the site to quickly collect some vegetation data. So we wanted to understand what the site was like where these units were deployed. Was there a lot of canopy trees? What were the species of those canopy trees? If it was a young forest, what type of young vegetation was there? And was it dense vegetation, etc. After we wrapped that up, I returned back to the lab and started processing landscape level data. So I wanted to understand what the landscapes were like surrounding these ARUs. Was it mostly forest? Was there some agriculture or urban mixed in, etc.? And once we collected those data, I was ready to start processing our audio recordings. So over the course of the two field season, we collected over 60 terabytes worth of data, or about 140,000 hours. And just to give you an idea of what, just some quick math here, that's about 16 years worth of straight listening. So it's not possible for us to sit down and listen through these clips to assess whether a whippoorwill was present. So we had to develop what's called a machine learned classifier. And what this is just training the computer to identify the image of a whippoorwill song. And that's exactly what we have over here on this image on the right-hand side. This is what's called a spectrogram, and these black lines are the whippoorwill song. So in a computer program that analyzes sounds, we listened through clips and identified whippoorwill songs and physically drew a box around them. And this basically told the computer this is what a whippoorwill song looks like. And then we developed, once this classifier was developed, we ran it on our recordings. And this quickly generated presence and absence, or occupied and unoccupied data. And this is the result of that classifier run. Those orange dots represent occupied sites, and about 44% of our sites were occupied. Now, using this occupancy data, we used it to inform statistical models that helped us better understand the species habitat associations. I'm going to go over some of those results, some of the most important results, but not all of them. First, at the site level, I'm just going to go very briefly over what this figure is here. So on this axis over here, if it's down low, it's not likely to have a whippoorwill. Up top, it's very likely. And then this is the number of trees, what's called basal area is the fancy term for it. So the number of canopy trees. So what we saw is a decreasing trend here. So a negative relationship with whippoorwill occupancy. So whippoorwill liked sites that did not have many trees. And if we were to take this image right here and put it on this graph, it would fall right around where my mouse is right now. And this makes a lot of sense whenever we think about the whippoorwill's ecology. It is not, it forages in these young forests, and it also vocalizes in these young forests. So it makes sense that they would be in sites that look like this. Next, at the landscape scale, we found that sites that had more oak forest in the landscape had a higher probability of being occupied by whippoorwill, so a positive relationship. And this too makes a lot of sense when we think about whippoorwill ecology. One of the primary food sources of the whippoorwill are moths, and moth species richness and the abundance of moths are highest in oak forests. Next was the amount of impervious cover in the landscape. So as the amount of impervious cover in the landscape increased, the probability of having a whippoorwill at the site decreased. So just as an extreme example here, so that's a negative relationship with urban land cover. Just as an extreme example here, we can think about the city of Pittsburgh here. We would not expect to have whippoorwill anywhere in this landscape that's pictured. However, if we go well outside the city limits into areas that are dominated by forest, mostly forest, we are more likely to have a whippoorwill present. And then finally, the amount of scrub shrub or young forest in the landscape. And this had it's called a quadratic effect, meaning that it peaked at an intermediate value. And that value was about 10%. Now, one caveat with this result is that current data sets that classify the amount of young forest in the landscape are not super accurate. So what we can say is that this 10% is likely a lower threshold of the amount of young forest the species needs in the landscape. And this association with a 10%, 15% young forest in the landscape makes a lot of sense when we think about the species. It needs diverse forest conditions, both young and mature forests during its time on the breeding grounds. Now, these statistical models were then used to create what's called a predictive map. And what this is it's mapped across our study area here. The red areas and oranges represent areas of high probability of being occupied by whippoorwill. And those blue, dark blue areas are low probability of being occupied by whippoorwill. So if we take a look at Center County, north central Pennsylvania, you could see how public land managers, these polygons here, these are public lands, and both public and private land managers, as well as conservation scientists, can use this tool to identify where whippoorwill are located, likely to be located in the landscape. Just some big conclusions here. Whenever we think about managing for eastern whippoorwill, landscape context is really important. Thinking back to that amount of urban land cover in the landscape result, if we create habitat and landscapes that do not have a high probability of occupancy, they're not going to be as effective as those that are placed in areas with a high probability of occupancy. So landscape context is really important. Next is that this species requires diverse forest conditions. Thinking back to the amount of scrub shrub as well as the amount of canopy trees results, it really points to the need for this species to have diverse forest conditions in the landscape, both young and mature forests. And then finally, if we wish to reverse this species decline, we need to really focus on creating and maintaining healthy and resilient oak forests. There's no arguing with the fact that our oak forests are in a ton of trouble right now. Between invasive plants, invasive insects, generational high grading, overabundant deer populations, and suppression of natural disturbances, our oak forests are in a ton of trouble. And undoubtedly, the conservation of this species is going to be linked with creating and maintaining healthy and resilient oak forests. So just quickly looking at some future research, we're starting to use what's called LiDAR, light detection and ranging data sets. And what this is just a 3D representation of the physical environment. And we're going to use this data set to understand what landscapes result in high abundance or high densities of whippoorwill. We understand where whippoorwill occupancy is highest, but now we want to know where the most whippoorwill is found. So if we were to take a look at these two landscapes that are shown here, the one on the left and the right there, which landscape would you expect to have a highest abundance of whippoorwill? The landscape on the left, right? We have young forests proximate to mature forests, those diverse forest conditions that the species needs, compared to that completely closed canopy forest on the right. Just like to quickly thank my technicians as well as my collaborators and of course my funder, the Natural Resource Conservation Services Conservation Effects Assessments Project. And I'm happy to take questions at the end of this. And feel free to reach out if you want to send me an email.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. That was all fascinating. And I know we'll love having you back at the Q&A portion at the end of the presentations. But next, I'm going to invite Anne on to talk about another species specifically, the Chuckwill's widow. So Anne, if you want to get set up.
Yes, ma'am. I'm very excited to talk with y'all about one of my favorite nightjar species. Let's get this started. The Chuckwill's widow. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about its just some brief life history, mention some things that we're doing to help improve habitat, and then give you some ways at the end that you can help out these birds and other species.
We're so excited, Anne. If you wouldn't mind, your Zoom bar screen is showing over top. If you could move that, that would be great.
How do I hide? How do I hide this? Let's see.
It's just covering up that great face of the
Yeah,
Chuckwill's widow.
and I apologize. I'm trying to figure out how to get this to hide.
Voting meeting controls, try that.
Meeting control.
Right where you were in more,
Mm-hmm.
and then scroll, like it's month. The 8th option there.
Hide floating. There we go. Thank you all. Sorry for sorry for that. I
Nope.
appreciate the help.
Thanks,
So.
everyone. Anne, you're set. Take it away.
Yes. All right. So Chuckwill's widow is part of the nightjar family, like the other species that we've been talking about, primarily nocturnal. They are the largest nightjar in North America. They're somewhere between the size of a robin and an American crow, if you haven't seen one, closer to the robin size. They're about 12 inches long and a wingspan about 22 to 24 inches, something like that. Their scientific name, Intrastomus carolinensis, comes from the Latin meaning cavern mouth. So like the other species we mentioned, they have this tiny little bill that opens up into this big wide gape, as you can see in that lower left-hand corner, that they use for catching insects and the like. So this particular species that I'll affectionately refer to as chucks is found primarily breeding throughout the southeastern United States and the Atlantic coast, and then winters through Mexico, the Caribbean, Central America, and a little bit of South America. And I have some range maps to share with y'all so you can get an idea of where they spend their time. The first one is an animated map. This is based on eBird data. So this may be some of your observations if you participate in this program. And so those observations are used to create predictive models for abundance. And this one is focused on the breeding season. So it's going to go fast, but you'll be able to see some colors flash up on the screen. Oops, here we go back. And so what we see is that in April and May, they start to arrive, they disperse to the breeding areas, and then somewhere around late July, August, September, they start heading back south. So what this looks like in a static form here is the orange is that breeding range throughout the Southeast and Atlantic. There's actually a small spot in southern Florida in this purple where they could be found year round. And then the blue is the kind of the wintering range. So there's a little bit like in very South Texas, through Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean, and then in South America, a little bit into Colombia and Venezuela. And so I would consider this species just personally more of like a medium distance migrant. And when I was doing my research for this webinar, I found this kind of fun, very old account from 1898 about a Chuck Will's widow that ended up on a shipboard, and kind of this naturalist observation of this species. And we often actually see a lot of migrant birds that end up kind of resting on ships. It's a very energetically taxing time. And this was just a really fun account that I had a lot of fun reading about it. And there's just a lot of mysteries that we don't know about this bird, including some of their migration pathways and the connections between breeding and wintering grounds. So do birds breeding in Georgia, do they have a spot where they specifically like to go for winter, or do birds wintering in Costa Rica usually return to a certain spot? And so these are some of the mysteries people are working on to unravel. This particular species, like the others, is that mottled brown and gray and black, perfect for camouflage for them. There are some subtle differences visually between males and females, but they're hard to distinguish. Within their breeding range, the two other species that they're most likely to be confused with are the common nighthawk, which you heard Gretchen talk about, but chucks lack that white wing bar that the nighthawks have. And then the eastern whippoorwill, and this is really hard, but chucks tend to be larger and more of a buffy brown overall. And the male Chuck Will's widows tend to have less white on the tail. But the easiest way to distinguish chucks from these others is through their sounds and their vocalizations. And they have a 4-note song or call that sounds like its name. So I'll play this for you. So often that first note is very faint and hard to hear, but you can hear that they do emphasize towards, kind of that third note of their call. And they call very rapidly. It can be up to 25 reps per minute. So they continuously call through the night and some of those early morning hours. This sonogram here kind of shows what that would look like. But they have some other really interesting sounds as well that are kind of fun if you're fortunate enough to hear them. Described as growls and clicks. Here's another version of that. All right, and then this one, which is called a quack. It's kind of a funny name for it. There it goes again. All right, so this particular species during the breeding season will spend its time in deciduous hardwood forests, pictured kind of in that lower left. And in my region, we'll find them in kind of open pine woods, and they'll use mixed woodlands. They're often found near open areas like clearing or edges of forest. This is really good foraging habitat for them, for those insects. Where Chuck Will's widows and eastern whippoorwills do overlap, the chucks tend to be in a little bit drier areas and a little bit more open landscape, but that's not a hard and fast rule at all. On the wintering grounds, they use subtropical woods, low and tropical forests, and even brush, thicket, and fields, any places that are really good to get that insect feast. So where my role comes in is thinking about how we can help improve habitat on the breeding grounds for all bird species, but especially thinking about this webinar for Chuck Will's widow. And we work, our particular joint venture partnership, the Lower Mississippi Valley Joint Venture, works in this region, kind of two ecoregions, the Mississippi Alluvial Valley and the West Gulf Coastal Plains and Ouachitas. This light green area is primarily where we find the Chuck-Will's widows. And looking here down at the bottom at breeding bird survey data, like other species, they're not doing super great. There's been a decline through time. But there is hope, and we're taking action to help improve habitat. A lot of the land in our area is privately owned. So we're working with private landowners through different programs to help improve habitat. We're working with the Natural Resources Conservation Service in Arkansas and Louisiana. And then we have like another program in Northeast Texas to help improve habitat. And so what we're doing is doing some forest management thinning to help open up the canopy, improve forest structure and condition for both nesting birds and for forage, and then using prescribed fire at that appropriate time to create a healthy understory for these birds. But with everything that we do, we like to make sure that we're seeing the response that we want. So similar to what Jeff had mentioned, we're also using ARUs. We're using Wildlife Acoustics brand stuff. And we're looking at bird response to these management actions and treatments. And so we have some 19 sites in Arkansas and Louisiana. We're hoping to build kind of a long-term data sets. And we're actually detecting Chuck-Will's widow at those sites. About 47% have picked them up. And we had another project in Northeast Texas looking at about 20 sites, and we detected Chuck-Will's widows there, about 85% of those sites. And so those sites all had some form of management that they seem to respond to. And so we're hoping that through time, by building this data, we can help to better understand some of the habitat associations that this species have, and in turn improve management and recommendations that we can make. So stay tuned. Someday soon we'll have some more fun stuff to report about this species. But for now, what I want to do is end with some really cool ways that y'all can help. You can help us figure out a little bit more about what these birds are doing. There's some nightjar surveys that you can participate in. And any information, as you've seen, that you put into eBird, it helps form these models that give us some idea of what these birds do during the different parts of their life cycle. You can also think about, if you have acreage, some habitat improvements to make. So check with your local wildlife agencies and NRCS offices there. Anything pollinator, insect-friendly plants and products, this group of birds, they're insectivorous. And so more pollinators, more insects for them is better. Migration, as I mentioned, is kind of a perilous time for birds. And so keeping dark skies, keeping lights off, there's some simple ways that even at home that you can help do this and help birds. And then helping to reduce window collisions, which frequently happens during migration as well. We have some tips on our website for how you can reduce some of these window collisions and just make the world a better place for birds. So with that, I want to thank y'all for listening to Chuck-Will's Widows, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Anne. I will welcome Gretchen and Jeffrey back for the Q&A. I just want to thank our audience. You all have been so engaged, and we have gotten so many questions. We're so grateful, and we definitely will be following up with more resources and information about these birds given the time. One of the things I want to make sure to address, since it came up a few times in registration and during the presentations, was light pollution specifically. So Anne, if you could talk a little bit more about dark skies and any impacts of light pollution on nightjars, just to kick things off, that would be great.
Yes, sure. I'll start, and then Gretchen and Jeffrey, you can chime in as well. Yeah, so light pollution, it's something we're trying to gain a better understanding of, but we know that birds often get drawn to very bright light, and they can get very disoriented by that light. And that in turn can actually lead to some of these big collisions that that you see. And so there have been some campaigns throughout the states. I think maybe Chicago is one of the longest standing ones of these lights out campaigns. You may see some of those in the news. And so, yeah, helping to darken the skies gives birds, a kind of a more, best way I can describe it, more chill, relaxed path for migration without all these, distractions and other things going on. So definitely helps.
In the interest of time, I'm going to move on to the next question. And Jeffrey, maybe you can kick things off. The line is that if you build it, they will come. And a lot of folks want to build habitat that will bring these birds back. Specifically, folks have shared that they have quite a lot of acreage and they really want nightjars to nest on their property, which wouldn't we all love that? But do you have any tips on specifically how folks can either get resources or support to help create the habitat where they are?
Yeah, absolutely. That's great to hear so many folks are interested in trying to help this species. One of the best things that I can refer everybody to is trying to find a forester nearby and talking to them about your goals, and having them work with you to develop a plan for your property on how to best manage for eastern whippoorwill. Look into best management practices for eastern whippoorwill. Look at some of the research. There isn't a ton, but such as my publication there, it mentions some ways landowners could manage their properties to create habitat for the species. But the best first step is working with a forester, and then also working with agencies like the Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS. Their farm bill programs are great. They can help landowners provide financial assistance to help create habitat for wildlife on your property. So yeah.
Thanks, Jeffrey. And Gretchen, could you maybe speak to the gravel rooftop aspect of that question? Because a lot of folks are like, I want to go out and put gravel on my roof. And don't get me wrong, I wish that would work, but maybe you can speak a little bit more to the nuance of that habitat.
Yeah, the struggle is they won't really, they have a lot of fidelity to their nest site. So if you have a history of them coming to your rooftop, try to find a way to conserve it. So if you're trying to find a way to make your rooftop easier to maintain and more thermal tolerant for your building, you can do green roofs. And there is somebody wrote a master's thesis on how to create eco roofs for both nighthawks and killdeer, by Jana Veal, who was the master's student out of University of Oregon. And so I recommend somebody looking up that if you're interested in specifics. She was a planning student, so it's really about the roof. But yeah, it's hard to attract them once they've kind of moved on. They've probably found someplace else. They're generalists, so they probably found somewhere else to go. Hard to bring them back once they go. But I encourage you to try.
And then the other thing that a lot of folks, again, with the habitat and how can we bring them back, we're asking about everything from solar farms and trying to be more intentional with having more gravel around those. A lot of folks asked if you can plant trees. So maybe, Anne, you could give us your input on, again, this habitat aspect of supporting these birds.
Yeah, so as we've mentioned, it kind of depends how much area you have. And so yeah, there's great ways to improve habitat through some active forest management to create the conditions that are optimal for these birds, both for nesting habitat and also that foraging habitat. And even in your backyard, like we mentioned, there's things that you can do to help some of the pollinator and insect populations, which in turn have, kind of these upward cascading, I guess that's not cascading, but these upward trophic effects. So no action is really too small to try and help contribute if you have a lot of land and you want to do some management, or if you just have, a much smaller space.
Thanks, Anne. And Gretchen, can we go back to you to talk about habitat across the ranges? Because these are really wide-ranging species overall, especially given their long migration. How can we help make sure they have habitat across their full annual life cycle? Is there anything that we should be thinking about or be concerned about? Just thinking that some of these birds nest in the boreal in Canada and go all the way to South America. Could you speak about the habitat of these birds?
Yeah, generally they like it open. So underbrush and forests are not great for nighthawks, but if they're migrating, they're probably not going to be on the ground. They're probably going to perch in a tree. And yeah, they can like a lot of different habitats as they migrate along. One thing I want to add is grassland species are really in peril, especially sort of the middle of the continent, right? And there was a really interesting study that the Nature Conservancy did about grassland birds, and it included nighthawks. And that was for shortgrass species, shortgrass specialists like nighthawks. You could, instead of converting to a row crop to make money off your land, you could instead graze animals. And that mimicked the shortgrass prairie that used to exist in the middle of the country when bison roamed. So it if you have like different options of how to work your land, sometimes just having livestock is pretty good habitat if you can't conserve a really nice grassland in of itself.
Jeffrey, do you have any comments on that, along with just thinking about where the main population or strongholds for these species are?
Yeah. So if we look at the whippoorwill, where the greatest proportion of the population is really in the Midwest, and then up it goes up into the Appalachians, and we're seeing a lot of success with habitat management efforts on private lands too. So maybe unlike what we see with nighthawks, where you can't necessarily draw them in super easily, whippoorwill, we see the species responding super well to management. On some of my private land sites, I've talked to landowners where they say some of the same stories that you all are saying. I used to have whippoorwills here 20, 30 years ago, and I don't anymore. And some of those same landowners are now calling me 2, 3 years after my project and saying, "Hey, I have them back now." So it's great, great success stories there. So there's, in terms of whippoorwill, there's nothing that says that if you create it, they will not come back to to those areas that you manage.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Our time is quickly running out, so I have one more question before we end for all of our speakers, but I'm going to add in a bonus, hopefully, for all of you. So that question is, what is one thing that you hope everyone takes away from this webinar and shares with a friend? But I'd love for you all to share a favorite fact or favorite memory of a nightjar as well, given how wonderful our audience has been. And we'll go in order of the presenters. So Gretchen, if you would start.
Yeah, I would just encourage people to talk about nightjars, tell people what they are, go look for them, go on eBird and find out where there are nightjars in your neighborhood. One really cool story, I mean, I have lots of field stories, but I have a recent one where somebody on Instagram posted that they saw 4 species of nightjars in one night in Kansas. So there are some cool stuff out there. They're there. You just have to find them and be awake at night, essentially. And nighthawks are mostly active around sunset and sunrise, but you can hear them at night sometimes.
And Jeffrey?
I would say my big takeaway is share everything that you've learned today. Share this video of this webinar. Talk to friends about nightjars. Make sure everybody knows that they're out there. That's really important. And I think that one fact going away from this is that it may seem like I have studied whippoorwill for a while, but I've actually only ever seen one whippoorwill in my life. So if you haven't seen them before, don't worry. I've only ever seen one, so.
So they are out of sight, but not out of mind.
Exactly.
And Anne?
Yeah, so I hope that our listeners take away, well, kind of two things. I mean, just how cool nightjars are, right? And the diversity of them out there. But just, yeah, thinking a little bit more intentionally about all the good things we can do to help these bird populations, and, just have a little bit of that positivity that things will get better. And so I think my favorite nightjar story, it doesn't actually involve a nightjar. I was at my house, and I live in a very urban area, and I heard a Chuck Will's widow call, like middle of the day. What is that? And I kept hearing it, and it wasn't quite right. Sure enough, a northern mockingbird was doing a spot-on impersonation of the Chuck Will's widow. And I don't know where that mockingbird heard it and learned it that fast, but yeah, it was pretty fun. So he fooled me.
That prankster.
Yeah.
Thank you so much to our presenters for all of your wonderful information. And thank you again to our really engaged audience. The conservation efforts you've heard about today are only possible thanks to members and supporters like all of you who care about birds and believe in ABC's mission to conserve them. As we speak, our experts are planning our conservation programs and projects for 2025 and beyond, which is why this is such a critical time of year for ensuring that we have the funds required to continue and expand our critical conservation efforts for birds. Thanks to a dedicated group of supporters, ABC has launched a special 1-to-1 Every Acre Counts match campaign with a goal of raising $1 million for bird conservation by December 31st. And your generous support will make it possible for ABC to conserve habitat for birds, as well as prevent extinctions, reverse population declines, and reduce threats for birds across the Americas. Support bird conservation right now by being part of our match, and you can give at abcbirds.org/EAC by scanning the code on your screen with your phone, or via the secure online donation form that will be directed to you after this webinar ends today. Thank you so much for sharing our mission to conserve birds throughout the Americas. Your support means we can make every acre count for birds like nightjars and all birds in need. Thank you so much again for caring about birds, and good birding.